Ladies and gentlemen, our next session, America's Security in the Age of Jihad, moderated by D. Roy Murdoch.
Thank you very much. My name is DeRoy Murdoch. I'm a Fox News contributor, a contributing editor with National Review Online. I'm also a media fellow with the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University. As I was preparing for today's panel, for which I thank you all for attending, I thought back to the very first time I came to CPAC, which was 1983. At that time, the United States faced an existential threat called communism. In fact, President Ronald Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire, and he predicted that we would throw the Soviet Union and communism onto the ash heap of history. And in 1989, we did exactly that. The Berlin Wall collapsed, and that was the end of communism. We can thank Ronald Reagan for his leadership in making that happen. Well, we're now at CPAC 2015, and America faces a new existential threat. It's called radical Islamic terrorism. Wow, wasn't that easy to say? Now, what do we do about radical Islamic terrorism? Here's an idea. Let's throw it next to communism on the ash heap of history. Now, the question is, how do we do this? And also, can we do this and how do we do this? Those are really the pertinent questions in relation to that proposition. And we have here a very, very distinguished panel of speakers who will address this matter and see where we go forward. We could have a veritable Army-Navy game with the gentleman you're about to hear. We have 2 veterans from the Army and 2 from the Navy. So let's thank them for their service to our country. I'm going to ask them to speak for 5 minutes each, and then I'll engage them in a few questions, and after that we'll welcome your questions as well. Our first speaker is Zuhdi Jasser, MD. He's the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. Dr. Jasser is a physician in private practice and a former lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy. Especially since September 11th, 2001, he's promoted liberty and combated political Islam and the stranglehold that Islamist groups and their overseas allies have placed on Muslim communities in America and abroad. Please welcome Dr. Zuhdi Jasser.
Thank you, DeRoy. And who would have thought a small-town Neenah, Wisconsin boy, son of political refugees from Ba'athist fascist Syria in the late 60s, who started as a Reagan conservative over 30 years ago writing a little high school column called On the Right Track, would now, post 9/11, serve my country again in this ideological fight against Islamism, and now be here on the main stage at CPAC. Thank you. If only my grandfather and father, who were heroes to me and patriots, were here to witness this. You know, this whole security discussion is really about what lens and what narrative we use to understand the problem and what vision our leaders have. Yes, at its essence, it's a Muslim problem that needs a Muslim solution. But we don't need a theologian-in-chief on Islam. What we have now is an excommunicator-in-chief who marginalizes reformers and maintains the status quo of the Islamist theocrats, and by not calling it Islamist, sadly gives platforms only to those who are part of the problem or part of the Islamist mafia globally and domestically. And unfortunately, what happens is the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, 56 countries and their apologists, their apologetics, and their global lobby end up obstructing any hope for reform and preventing any strategy against the ideology that threatens us. The ISISes of the world don't come out of thin air. They are violent, and they're the violent, militant, savage endpoint of a continuum of political Islam and its ideology that really is part of not just the Islamic State, but all Islamic states. One example, and you can fill in the blank with Iran, Pakistan, or any Islamic republic, but look at Saudi Arabia, our so-called ally. Shares none of our values. They demonize the West. They prohibit churches. They can't carry a Bible. You can't worship publicly as Christians. And yet they behead and whip Sunni Muslims who try to reform and dissent. And ultimately, their Islamic State is a boot camp, is a prison that ultimately creates the future ISISes of the world. We must have forgotten that 15 of the 19 hijackers were also al-Qaeda activists and militants from Saudi Arabia. The OIC, or as I like to call them, the Neo-Caliphate of 56 Islamic countries, is now based in Jeddah, to no surprise. So you tell me, who's the evil empire of today? It's the Islamic states across the world. But the drug that inspires the evil of Islamo-patriotism, as I call it, or the Islamic statism, is political Islam and that ideology. So if we're going to drain the pool in which militants swim in, you have to counter Islamism as an ideology. This concept of countering violent extremism, that's only a symptom, that's a tactic. The ideology is Islamism, and that's why our American Islamic Forum for Democracy wasn't about countering terrorism, it was about countering Islamism and promoting liberty through the separation of mosque and state. This battle is within Islam. And there's nothing more American than fighting against theocracy. It's about Muslims who are waking up against both dictatorship and theocracy. And we need leadership to take sides in this battle within the House of Islam. And there's no one else other than the free world that can do that. The barriers have been many. Political correctness, all of the apologetics, the sense that we have common enemies with many of these countries, but we forget that they produce these ideologues. And right now, various Muslims are radicalized. Why? Not because they need jobs or they're uneducated. They're radicalized because they want to die for the Islamic State. The only counter to that are Muslims who want to die for liberty, who want to die for America, want to die for secular freedom. And there are Muslims rising through the Middle East that want that. The Muslims who rejected to the millions the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. The Muslims who just a month and a half ago rejected An-Nahda, the Islamist party in Tunisia. The Muslims of the Green Revolution that our administration abandoned in 2009 in Iran. So ultimately, regime after regime of Islamic theocracies can be endorsed and pushed against and defeated if we promote liberty in those countries. But ultimately, we have to stop this political correctness. We have to stop the hyperbolic victimization mantras, the infantilization of Muslims as victims, but not as leaders who have to reform against the very ideologies that threaten us. I'm here to tell you, as an American patriot, that this battle is within the House of Islam, and it is intensely American. Our founding fathers fought against theocracy, and they defeated it. Why can't Muslims have that same vision? Our current administration tells us that the doctrine is one of strategic patience. What is that? It's basically a Darwin doctrine where the most evil and vile survive in the Middle East. We need a doctrine of liberty, a liberty doctrine in the Middle East that engages reformers and is not afraid to name the enemy. And there are many Muslim reformers that are looking for our leadership. Many of my friends that are part of this reform movement say you have to name it to tame it, as Ezra Nomani has said. And ultimately, we need a convention, a conversation in America that doesn't infantilize Muslims but engages us as part of the leadership necessary to reform political Islam and reject the ideas that are radicalizing our communities. So we need to transition as a country from the apologia to the end of this whack-a-mole program where we hit the terror where it comes up in any country, or domestically we counter these militants as if they come out of thin air, and we begin to engage against the ideology of political Islam, but we also recognize that spiritual Muslims that are rejecting theocracy are our best assets. They reformed the Middle East, are doing so through an Arab awakening that ultimately used Western technologies, be it Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube. We need to empower the technology of reform, the technology of liberty, and we need a president that can do that. In the book, Out of Revolution, Autobiography of Western Man, Eugene Rosenstock said, "To a mankind that recognizes the equality of man everywhere, every war becomes a civil war. So American security in the age of jihad depends upon the advancement of liberty and the confrontation of Islamist theocracy. We can only win this if you empower reform-minded Muslims. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zudi. Our next speaker is Major Pete Hegseth. Pete Hegseth is the CEO of Concerned Veterans of America, the United States' largest conservative veterans advocacy organization. Let's hear it. Pete is a Fox News contributor and a regular on the Kelly File, Fox and Friends, America's Newsroom, and Outnumbered. He's an Army veteran of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Guantanamo Bay. He has been awarded 2 Bronze Stars and a Combat Infantryman's Badge for time in Iraq and Afghanistan. He has a politics degree from Princeton and a master's in public policy from the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Let's hear it for Major Pete Hegseth.
Thank you very much, DeRoy, and it's an honor to be a part of such a great panel. As DeRoy mentioned, I'm the CEO of Concerned Veterans for America. We're a veterans and military families organization dedicated to fighting for the freedom and prosperity here at home that we fought for while in uniform or overseas. It's the belief that when you raise your right hand to defend this Constitution, there's no reason why when you come home that service should stop. So we've got a bunch of veterans that have been here at CPAC and across the country for the last couple of years building a movement of veterans. We have real Special Forces members, sorry, Mr. VA Secretary, and we have real combat veterans, sorry, Brian Williams. But we're here to talk about national security in the age of jihad. National security, what does it mean? It means the preservation of a free society, political freedom, religious pluralism, and economic freedom. And how do we talk about the age of jihad? What is the age of jihad? Do we talk about it from the 7th century, or from the age of Muhammad? Do we talk about the rise of Wahhabism, the Muslim Brotherhood, the recent attacks on the West starting in the 1970s, or post 9/11? The age of jihad spans quite a spectrum of time, and you have to understand their view and their long view of history in order to understand the jihad they wage today. So in order to confront this Nazism or communism of our time, you have to know who your enemy is, you have to know what they believe, and you have to determine whether you can deter and defeat them with non-military means, as this administration would prefer to, or whether or not you ultimately would have to defeat them on the battlefield and what it would take. Who is our enemy? Make no mistake about it, our enemies are Muslims who have a particular interpretation of the Quran. Again, I'll put the necessary caveat in there. Not all Muslims, most Muslims do not prescribe to that perspective, but the ones who do read the Quran quite literally and pull from the text a literal interpretation that is in the text that informs why they do what they do. If you read the Quran chronologically, it reads from a peaceful document to a more violent document when Muhammad was leading armies and capturing Mecca and Medina. The jihadists today choose to pull from that portion of the text and are motivated by it. Islam is not simply a religion of peace or simply a religion of violence. It is a religion of submission. Submission by its adherence to the text and the belief that everyone else must submit to that portion of the text. Muslims and non-Muslims, their goal is that we all submit. And if we don't, we are enslaved or we are killed. What do they believe? They believe in the inevitability of the caliphate, that their Islamic worldview will and must expand. And this isn't just radicals who are using violence. I interact with many Muslims in Iraq and Afghanistan. One in particular, an interpreter in Afghanistan, who said to me, Westernized guy, he lives in the United States today, great guy, I would trust him with my life. He said, inevitably, Pete, Islam will rule the world. The prophet foretold it. It's in the text. We're having 10 kids, and you're having 1. And over time, whether through violent or nonviolent means, the West will be made to submit. That wasn't his preference. That's not what he wants. But he saw in the theology that so many have heard in so many generations, the belief that it is ultimately Islamic supremacy that will rule, whether that's through peaceful means or through the more violent means that the Islamic State chooses to pursue right now. Can you deter them or defeat them with non-military means? Can we load enough hashtags into our magazines, round them into an M4, and shoot them at the enemy? I fear our hashtag technique and hashtag surges are not going to get it done. Of course, information warfare is important. Discrediting the ideology of our enemies is part of defeating that ideology, and it must be done. But you can't do it alone. And the best way to deter, and the only way to ultimately defeat an enemy like this, is to put many, many, many of them into the ground. I quote from the great philosopher Mark Levin, "You kill ISIS." But it's not just about defeating their ideology, and it's not just about killing them. And of course, the Iranian bomb is actually the greatest threat on the Shia side of this angle, I think, that we face today, of all of them. It's about awakening America to what we would need to do to undertake and confront this threat. A civic re-education of our country to remind our people that America is exceptional, is great, that our rights come from a creator, and we have duties as Americans to defend the rights that we cherish here, that we have to fight for them, and we will have to continue to fight for them. That's something that veterans and military families and this panel understand more than most. So I encourage and appreciate what you do in being involved in the civic process. That's what Concerned Veterans for America is doing, is awakening what they did on the battlefield to come home and make sure Americans understand that freedom at every turn must be defended and has always come at a cost. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pete. Our next speaker is J.D. Gordon. J.D. Gordon was a former Pentagon spokesman serving between 2005 and 2009. He's a retired Navy commander. He's currently the executive director of Protect America Today. He is a contributing columnist with Fox News and the Washington Times. He also served as the former Vice President of Communications and Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to the Herman Cain presidential campaign. Please put your hands together for J.D. Gordon.
Thanks so much, DeRoy. Thanks also to Matt Schlapp for the kind invitation today. I wanted to thank DeRoy for my current career as well. You know, I first met DeRoy when I was a Pentagon spokesman. I was a Navy commander. I was responsible for speaking about DoD policy and what we're doing in the Western Hemisphere. And in that capacity, I went to Guantanamo over 30 times. And during the 2008 campaign, I heard then Senator Obama, talking all about Guantanamo. And then he got elected, and one of his first acts was to sign an executive order to close it. And I thought, he has no idea what he's talking about. The Guantanamo that I know and that he's talking about are like two different planets. So I asked DeRoy, who is a columnist for Scripps Howard, how do I go about getting the truth out? He's like, well, my think tank is hiring. So I joined him there. So I would like to talk about violent extremism. President Obama doesn't like to talk about the real threat we face from radical Islam. But I do like to mention we faced radical violent extremists since America existed. If you look at 1901, Leon Soglos was in Buffalo. He killed President McKinley. He was an anarchist. It was a far-left ideology. 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy. He was a communist, another violent ideology. Before that, we fought and defeated the Nazis, another violent ideology. Today's violent ideology, that's the #1 threat to America, is from radical Islam. I believe that if Leon Soglos and if Lee Harvey Oswald were alive today, they'd be radical Islamists. There's never a shortage of violent thugs out there to adopt an ideology to try to attack and destroy America. So I think today we need a cultural revolution within Islam to prevent this type of ideology. It's a poisonous ideology, and it starts with education. I believe in places like Saudi Arabia, in Iran, they have to change the textbooks for children. They have to stop teaching them hate, start teaching them tolerance. They need gender equality because they have massively dysfunctional societies over there, in part because of the gender separation there. I do think we also have to change the blasphemy laws, push them to change the blasphemy laws. You know, we ought to be pressuring Saudi Arabia a lot more. Zudi was right when he mentioned 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. And excuse me, it's not about jobs. Well, those guys were wealthy. Those guys were educated. Look, Jihadi John was just unmasked, if you will, the guy who's beheading Americans and British over there. This guy was a college graduate in the UK. His family was wealthy. This is not about jobs. It's about a poisonous ideology that we have to defeat. Pete was also right when he talked about that threat from Iran. The radical Islamist threat is a two-headed threat. One is from Iran, that's the Shia branch. They're working hard to get a nuclear weapon. And that nuclear accord, I'm sorry, that's not going to stop them. That's just going to slow them down. There are three parts to the nuclear weapon. That's the uranium enrichment, the nuclear warhead, and the missile. Well, guess what? That accord that Secretary Kerry keeps talking about only deals with uranium enrichment, not the other two. And in fact, there's a base, Parchin, south of Tehran, where Iran's believed to be working on nuclear components. That's off limits for the accord. So how could you trust Iran? So I think Iran long-term is the greatest threat, but it is a two-headed threat. The other head is the Sunni terror groups like Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Ansar al-Sharia, Al-Shabaab. These groups have been attacking us since the 1970s, and they're not going to stop because of the ideology. Let me tell you another thing about Saudi Arabia. They've spent over $100 billion since the 1970s in exporting radical Islam. And they're also spending money in Washington on lobbying today to convince us there's no problem with radical Islam. So let's ask the question, why is President Obama not acknowledging the fact that it's radical Islam? That's a valid question to ask. I think it has to do with this de facto alliance between the international left and Islamists. The international left used to support communists. They had a problem with American power. Well, communism's not cool anymore. But radical jihad, that's the new ideology. So the international left and these Islamists have this de facto alliance. You know, I do a lot of debating on TV, including in the Middle East. In the Middle East, I debate a lot of leaders over there, think tankers, pundits. They call me a colonialist many times. You want to know why? Because I support Israel's right to exist. Because I support Israel, I'm a colonialist to them. That's the same type of mentality that the international left in this country has. They may not say it, but that's the same mentality. That's why the international left won't say it's radical Islam, because they're both united in this so-called anti-colonial movement from Latin America to the Middle East. And lastly, my last point, we have to make sure our U.S. law enforcement authorities and our intelligence authorities have all the tools they need to stop this threat before they kill more of us, before we have more 9/11s. They have to balance it with our privacy. Sure, of course they do. But our law enforcement cannot continue to be hampered like they are under this administration. The same with our intelligence authorities. This administration and some people in the House and Senate have attacked the CIA. That's got to stop. We need all the intelligence and all the law enforcement authorities to do their jobs to stop terrorism before they hit us again. DeRoy, thanks so much. Thanks for listening.
And our final 5-minute opening statement will come from Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer, retired. He is a highly experienced intelligence officer and recipient of the Bronze Star with 30 years of field and operational experience. In fact, he was in charge of Field Operating Base Alpha, a joint DIA-CIA unit conducting classified collection and special operations support regarding terrorists just after the September 11th attacks. He currently is, as I am, a senior fellow at the London Center for Policy Research. Please welcome Tony Schaefer.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here. It's my first CPAC, so bear with me. Yogi Berra once said, "It's like deja vu all over again." What do I mean by that? Well, I started off 35 years ago chasing terrorists in Germany. Something called low-level source operations. I was undercover as a second lieutenant, one of my first assignments, going out trying to protect the troops doing something called reforge, return of forces to Germany. And our job was to protect our troops against two groups, the RAF, the Red Army faction, a Soviet-funded terrorist group, and elements of Gaddafi's terror groups conducting terrorist operations in Germany. They bombed their Berlin disco in 1986 and things like that. So to my libertarian friends who criticize a lot of what we say, I ran into one yesterday during one of our panels saying it's our fault for being involved. No, it's not. As a matter of fact, this goes back to Jefferson, to the Marine Corps. A shout out to the Marine Corps, because within their own hymn, the Sands of Tripoli has to do with the fact that they were fighting Islamic jihadists in the time of Jefferson. So this is not new. It is simply reborn. So let's walk through the facts that we have to understand. First and foremost, We have won every tactical battle over the past 13 years, and yet we're not winning the war. Think about that. My good friend, Major General Tim Williams, the Adjutant General of Virginia, and the Virginia Guard, if let loose, could go into the desert and take out ISIS in 30 days. It is not about military capacity. It is about the fact we've lost the will to win and do what's necessary to achieve our own objectives, and frankly, those objectives usually bring peace and prosperity for those we work with. This is not simply about domination. It's not about empire. It's about defining what we need to do to secure our interests in the American people. Reagan was excellent in defining the enemy. It's already been alluded to. He called out the evil empire. And I remember that as a member of the military when that came up. Ooh, he called out the Soviets. And I've talked to Reagan, members of the Reagan White House, and they said there was great pushback from those on the left about calling the evil what it was. Oh, it'll push them over the edge. It'll cause them to overreact. Well, it did, and we won the Cold War. I think it's time for a little bit of overreaction. And even to his credit, Jimmy Carter recognized his own mistakes. The Reagan buildup actually started under Jimmy Carter. It was completed by Ronald Reagan by 1986 and was in full bloom and blossom, and it was key because it was a strategy. Notably, the defense budget started falling after 1986. 1987, there was actually a round of cutbacks. That's the year I came here permanently, during a round of cutbacks. So you can be both a good steward of the defense budget and the American people's money and be effective. The reason we're not being effective is because we choose politically to not be effective. And that's what we have to fix. That's what's wrong right now, and that's something we all have to address, every one of us. No matter what party we are, we have to understand the president's refusal to define the Islamic threat for what it is threatens everybody and our allies, period. Now, as a practitioner of what we do for over 35 years, it's amazing to see the high school debating team in charge of national security. I mean, really, you've got a bunch of 14-year-olds who would be better off basically reciting Shakespeare in some high school production than trying to posit national security policy. It's totally insane. And when we look at the chaos that's been caused, it's totally amazing. So let me talk two quick stories about what I want to highlight today. Reagan, during his time as a president, was able to talk the language necessary for the adversaries to understand. One event more than others, caused the Russians to understand he was serious. Does anybody know what that one event was? One thing he did. Any guesses? That was the firing of the air traffic controllers. No doubt. No, I've run the tapes on this. The Russians became aware that he was a serious man when he was willing to do what was necessary to clean his own house. That's what put the fear of God in them. It's time we learn the language of our adversary and speak it. We don't have to put boots on the ground, but we must be effective in our messaging and use of our combat forces as necessary. So again, it's deja vu all over again. We've been here before. We need to get out of this cycle and win this and win it permanently. Thank you very much.
Good job, Tony. Well done. Before we turn to the audience for questions, I want to pose a couple of quick questions to our panel. Ask them to give brief answers since our time is very limited, unfortunately. There's a very interesting article in the Weekly Standard's March 9th issue by Stephen Hayes called Obama's Failure. And there's a fascinating excerpt in it, which I'll read and ask them just to comment on. It goes as follows. The U.S. government captured more than 1 million documents during the May 2011 raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Top administration officials initially described it as a treasure trove of intelligence on al-Qaeda and its affiliates. But more than 3 years later, the senior DIA official who ran the project, Colonel Derek Harvey, says the intelligence community has fully analyzed less than 10% of the collection. Top DIA officials were told directly to stop providing analyses based on the bin Laden documents. The administration had decided to end the war on terror, and no amount of new intelligence about threats from al-Qaeda was going to change their minds, so they chose ignorance. How do you respond, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser?
Well, I think this really highlights exactly where we've been missing in action, is that You know, in the Cold War, we had hundreds of scholars in the Pentagon and in the Beltway studying radical Islam, studying communism and the Soviet war theory. Right now, you can probably count them on one hand and nobody knows who they are, because if we discuss them, they'd probably lose their jobs. So this is putting us at significant liability in the war because we don't understand. You know, obviously, as my military colleagues will tell you, you can't defeat an enemy that you don't understand. And yet, even on intelligence committees at the Center for Security Policy just mentioned, you have a congressman who has significant connections to the Brotherhood that now has a position on the Intelligence Committee. As you see, we don't have a filter in government for Islamists. So when we're not doing the intelligence necessary, we don't even understand who the threat is, and we're bonding and using advice from Islamist ideologues that ultimately are helping our enemies, and as a result are giving us poor advice, and we don't do the homework necessary. So we have no idea of what the ideology is, so therefore we don't know who our allies are. The allies, and Eitan Sharansky had a great piece in the Washington Post a few weeks ago in which he mentioned, you know, during the Reagan era, we were bonding with the prisoners of conscience. We would recognize people like Eitan Sharansky as the heroes of Russia and hopefully the end of the Soviet Union. Today, the prisoners of conscience like Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia and others who are whipped and flogged for trying to reform Islam are ignored while we ally with Islamist agents both in America and abroad.
Pete, what's your reaction to that story?
I agree. The president chooses to ignore those documents because he believes he was elected to do two things: fundamentally transform America and end wars. And that's exactly what he's attempting to do. Fundamentally transform America here at home and get us out of the Middle East as quickly as possible. Because his belief is that America is the reason for the problems there. America is the source of the ill. America is the reason why folks try to kill us. And he forgets that, of course, all of these attacks, their ideology, 9/11 was not a response to things that we had done, but it was a response to beliefs that those men had. So I think it has to do with he's willfully ignoring the reality in front of him, just like he did in Iraq when he chose not to pursue a status of forces agreement with a residual force that would have been able to keep the lid on there and shepherd an Iraqi government so that we didn't see ISIS. And instead we got the black flag of ISIS flying over Fallujah because he was more interested in ending wars than finishing them properly. And for those of us that believe in a strong national defense, that doesn't mean you have to have hundreds of thousands of boots on the ground in perpetuity. It means you're responsible about the application of power, keeping in mind the national security interests of the United States first, and the president has fundamentally forgotten that.
Time is our enemy, unfortunately. Very briefly, about 30 seconds each. J.D. Gordon, 90% of these bin Laden documents ordered not to be translated. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's not surprising at all. Look, this is the White House that blamed Benghazi on a video. So I think they're trying to mislead the American people at every step. And I'd also add one more thing. If you look at the Quadrennial Defense Review at the Pentagon, the major strategic paper, look how much is devoted to climate change. A lot more than you'll see about these kind of things. Unfortunately, that's their priority. It's a flawed mindset that's going to get more Americans killed, unfortunately.
Wow, killer icebergs, amazing. And last but not least, Tony, what do you think about this?
Yeah, no, look, this is, in my judgment, criminal. The idea is you take an oath of office, we all have. That oath does not abandon itself. It does not wear out. It is always relevant. And it's atrocious that we see government officials being so vacant in their responsibility that you are seeing criminal neglect of the need to protect the American people and our interests. And again, I agree. We don't need to be boots on the ground. We have to be effective in using special operations and other things. And to do that, you have to have good intelligence to be precise in the delivery. And this White House has been atrocious using drones. You know, like the idea is we should be precise with the use of force so we can capture people, interrogate them, and learn how the network works. To defeat a network, you must understand how the network functions. That's why you've seen this exponential growth of ISIS, because everywhere Al-Qaeda was, ISIS is now at, because we've let the network go. We've not analyzed the documents we should have, and you see the catastrophe now that's occurring in front of us.
It's remarkable. I read that article that somebody actually ordered these documents not to be translated. One word popped in my head, and that word was treason.
Yep, they're here.
We have about, unfortunately, about 4.5 minutes for questions, very briefly. So let's have a couple of brief questions and keep our answers brief as well. Let's see, do we have a microphone, or are people just going to stand up and holler?
Sound off.
Okay, sir, right here.
I'm Anthony Sennett. I'm a retired Marine officer.
Cool.
I have co-founded a non-governmental organization called the First North American Expeditionary Force. We are prepared to sign a memorandum.
Microphone right there.
Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq to provide education and training support to them. They've asked us for medical training to start with. 1,000 of them have died since June, 5,000 wounded. They only have 14 brigades. They've lost a brigade to casualties. I wonder if anybody will comment. I was happy to hear talk about allying ourselves with what I will call the champions of liberty out of the Islamic world. If anybody is the champion of liberty, where you can be a Jew, you can be an atheist, you can be a Yazidi, who are Kurds, by the way. You can be a Shiite, Sunni, you can be a Roman Catholic, you can be a Chaldean Catholic, a Syrian Catholic. They're all finding shelter in the 3 provinces of the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Thank you. And they're asking for conventional force help. They've got special operators. They want more bombardment from the air. Is there any chance that this administration can be pressured into providing that kind of support and providing some kind of stronger leadership to the coalition?
Let's give Zudi a chance to answer that question briefly. Go right ahead.
Well, I think ultimately, as you mentioned, the Kurdish community, for example, needs weapons to protect themselves from ISIS, and we're not giving them what they need. So we need to arm the Kurds. And don't forget, Kurds are Sunni Muslims. So ultimately, there are reform-minded, secular Muslims out there who need our help. The Syrian revolution started as a secular revolution against dictatorship, and our red lines moved. We allowed basically Assad to ally himself with Shia jihadism, and you have 2 jihadist entities, Sunnis versus Shia, fighting while the moderates are being lost. We need a strategy to empower. Now, I'm not saying 100% we wouldn't arm the wrong people, but for the majority sense, I mean, come on, we're already arming the Saudis, the others. We have to realize that the long-term vision is to begin to have a vision of arming moderates so that they can defeat both secular fascists and the theocratic fascists.
Excellent. I think we, at this point, unfortunately, have run out of time for questions, so I'm glad this gentleman was able to say something. Do we have bullet points as to what we've learned here and also next steps? If we can see those on the screen, this will give us a sense of what we've learned here. Well, what we learned is that Islamism is the politicization of the religion. The Iranian bomb is an even greater threat to America's security than ISIS. Islam needs a revolution from within, a cultural shift to overhaul education, rewrite textbooks, stop medieval blasphemy laws and punishments, embrace tolerance, and promote gender equality. Islamism, the theocratic Islamic State, is the threat, and liberty is the solution. And the new evil empire is the organization of the Islamic cooperation and its allies. I believe we probably have some next steps people can follow. Do we have that slide for more information? We have quite a few things here, but any book by Andy McCarthy, who's terrific. Trial of 1,000 Years, World Order and Islamism, book by Charles Hill. Heritage Foundation, Center for Secure Free Society, Protect America Today, a number of others. And let's see the final slide as to next steps that people back home can take in order to take action. Read the Quran and or commentaries, know what motivates rightly or wrongly our enemies. Engage Muslim reformers who advocate liberty domestically and abroad, marginalizing the theocrats or the Islamists. Engage with us at www.aifdemocracy.org or subscribe to our list. You can follow Dr. Zudi Jasser at those particular addresses. Push for Islamic reform, support true moderate Muslim leaders like in Egypt, Jordan, and Bahrain, and support law enforcement and intelligence agencies with the tools they need to stop terror attacks. There's a lot of work we all need to do on this, folks. I think we've gotten some good ideas to start, but there's a lot of work ahead, and I'm so glad that we were here to focus on this, and thank you so much for your attention. Well done, sir.